Mike Canaday, and I'm a contract grazer in California. We run about 4,000 head of goats. My wife and I, we started with 5 goats, and we're up to right around 4,000. I've seen a lot of misinformation, in my opinion, on YouTube about goats and fencing. My number one suggestion would be to be smarter than the goat. All right, my name is Mike Canaday, and I'm a contract grazer in California. We run about 4,000 head of goats. I've seen a lot of misinformation, in my opinion, on YouTube about goats and fencing. My wife and I, we started with 5 goats, and we're up to right around 4,000. We couldn't have got here without electric fencing. Electric fencing will definitely keep a goat in, and almost all goats will stay in with electric fencing if they're introduced correctly to it. Now, we're going to talk about a few different things that are not going to work for you. The stuff we're going to talk about right now is stuff that will not work. And the first thing you need to know about electric fencing is how much electricity does it take, how much voltage does it take to be able to keep the animals in. Now, if you're talking about cattle, horses, and you probably only need about 2,500 volts. If you're talking about keeping coyotes out, and if you're talking about keeping goats in, goats are some of the hardest things to keep in. Sheep have a lot of wool on them, and so when we're talking about sheep and goats, I want to see my fences running about 8,500 volts. And the biggest issue that people seem to have is they don't really know what the fence is doing, and you've got to test your fence in a few different places. Now, the one thing that you're not going to be able to do is, and I see people doing it, I see them doing it on YouTube, is they'll holler to their spouse and say, "Hey, baby, come on over here, grab this wire," so they can test the fence. And she'll scream and holler and jump up and down, and the guy will think that fence is working just fine. Truth is, just because it'll light your old lady up doesn't mean it's going to work to keep goats in the fence. And you need a really good fence tester. And this one here is actually in use. You can see it's kind of a little dirty. But it's a SpeedRite fault finder. Stafix, S-T-A-F-I-X, also makes one. It's pretty much the same. I don't know if the company's the same or not, but they make the same tester. Gallagher makes a good tester. These testers can test over 10,000 volts, and you need a fence charger that can put out 10,000 volts. If you start out with, say, you test one of the fence testers, and I want to show you where that big 0 is, that's actually not the voltage. What that tells you is how much leakage is on the fence, how many amps, where there's a draw, and which direction the draw is so you can fix the fence. Up in this very corner, up in the corner over here, that's actually the voltage. If you've got one of those light testers, it's got 5 lights on it, that's not going to tell you. You're not going to be able to keep goats in. So the number one thing you need to do is know how much voltage is in your fence. The other thing that you need to do is never, ever leave it off because you think the goats are broke to stay in. It just teaches them to get out. A guy on YouTube lost a baby goat in the fence. The fence wasn't on because he didn't want the little baby to get shocked, so he turned the fence off, and then sometime during the day, the little baby got caught in that fence, got caught in that net fence, and that's we use always net fencing, got caught in the net fencing, got all wrapped up in it, all balled up in it. The bottom line is you got to keep that fence on all the time. You got to be able to keep the animals out of it. It's not a physical barrier. It is a psychological barrier. And that's what we're working with here. So it's always got to be on. It's the safest thing. People say, well, we don't want the little babies to get shocked. More than likely, if from time to time you turn that fence off, you're going to end up with dead animals in it. And even if they're not dead, we've had in the past where you get a bad battery or whatever. Animal gets caught into it, has an extremity wrapped up in the fencing, in the net fencing. It's like a tourniquet. The limb can atrophy. You'll end up with an animal that you'll have to put down. So never, ever, ever run your fences without them having juice in them. Okay, now the other thing, you're going to need a good fence charger. Now, a good fence charger can put out, with not being hooked to the fence, if you just test it with one of these testers, and why I'm saying one of these testers, they can test over 10,000 volts. A lot of the cheaper ones can't do that. And if you just hook up the fence tester directly to the Energizer, that should have over 10,000 volts in it to have one that'll keep goats in. The SpeedRite 3000 can do that. I know that because that's what we use. There's probably other ones that can do it, but usually what cannot do it is the ones that people buy that have a little solar panel built on it, maybe like Yay. And there's just those little solar panels can't put out enough juice to really get the power into those Energizers so that they can have that kind of voltage. If you start out with 10,000 volts and you hook it to the fence and it drops to 8,000 or 8,500, that's one thing. Anything happens, a tree branch goes down onto it, it's going to lose some voltage. If you don't have at least 5,500 volts in that fence and all the way around, coyotes can get in there. That fence, that netting fence, that's your number one defense against predators, is the fence itself. You've heard the dogs barking, and those are Anatolian shepherds. They are our second leg of defense. We don't want them getting in a fight with a predator, but we want them barking and keeping those predators away. The fences that we set up, they're usually anywhere from 3 to 4 to 5 acres. Keeps the dogs in contact with the livestock. On that size of a fence, you can usually keep a lot of voltage in there. A lot of people have a lot of predator loss, and I've heard some folks on YouTube saying they have 10% predator loss, and so if a rancher's got, say, 3,000 head, that's a lot of animals. That's a lot of dead animals. That's hundreds of dead animals. It's really important that we understand the coyote, too. And the coyote usually does not jump these netting fences. And the netting fence that we use is 42 inches. It's sold by Premier Fencing, and it has semi-rigid stays that keep that fence from sagging. The coyote will not jump that fence. What he tries to do is stick his head through it. They'll try to stick their head through it and squeeze through it. You'd be surprised what a coyote can squeeze through. That's why you need 5,500 volts, and that coyote needs to get hit by that voltage that you built up in that fence. And if that happens, that coyote, they're a very wary animal, and that coyote will be able to get the other coyote that he's running with. And out here in the West, the western coyote, sometimes you'll see 6 or more of them running in a pack, and that's usually juveniles less than a year old. and they're pretty dangerous, and they're smart. But if one of them gets hit by your fence, it can actually transmit that there's danger there to the other coyotes. And so you don't have to actually have every coyote hit that fence. And where we are out here, there's just tons of coyotes, and people are always saying, well, you know, you must have a lot of coyote loss. Actually, we don't. We have very little. Out of the 4,000 animals that we have, we don't lose 1%. It's just not that many. It doesn't necessarily transfer over to cats, because cats can jump that fence. If you're talking about a bobcat or mountain lion, they usually don't even get hit by the fence. We don't have bears, but I understand it is effective also on bears. But you're going to need a lot of voltage. It goes back to that fence tester. Know what the voltage is all the time. Keep the fence on all the time. So here's another thing that will not work. That's Paws and Egg fence. Premier One, I think it's Premier One Supplies. And if you do a internet search on Premier One and fencing, they will come up, and they have, in my opinion, the best netting fence for either goats or chickens or whatever you're trying to keep. Their fencing has those vertical stays so the fence doesn't sag. Anytime a fence is sagging, it's losing a lot of voltage. I've seen some of these guys on YouTube. They'll have these huge fence chargers, big fence chargers, 12 joule chargers, and again, we're using like a 3 joule charger. And the fence, when you look at it, it's all sagging. The corners, when you build a fence, any kind of fence, the corners have to be at least straight. They can't be sagging down. The corners sag, the whole fence is going to sag. If the fence sags, and especially if it's in green grass, it's almost impossible to get any kind of decent voltage through it. Yeah, they might get 2,500 volts. But it's not going to be enough to keep the predators out and to keep the goats in consistently. As much as I believe in Premier Fencing, they will sell people stuff called Paws and Egg fence. And what that is that in a regular fence, you touch the fence, the electricity goes in your arm, down your body, and it goes out through your feet. In a Paws and Egg fence, one wire is a positive, the next one's a negative, the next one's a positive, the next one's a negative, all the way to the bottom. The thing with goats is they're smarter and they're more devious than sheep, and they'll figure out that the bottom 2 wires on that, the bottom one is just basically a piece of plastic. The next one going up is negative. Well, goats could figure that out, that the bottom one is not going to hurt them, the next one up isn't going to hurt them, and they'll start taking their nose and flicking that fence up till they can get their nose underneath that bottom one, and it teaches the goats to get out. The Paws and Egg fence will teach goats to get out. So you want to stay away from that. Just get regular positive fence. It's cheaper anyways. And use the proper grounding system. Lots of times, almost always, people think they get away with one ground rod at about that far in the ground. Out here, we can't. Again, it's because probably we just don't get enough moisture in the ground. But when you read the directions on your energizers, any decent-sized energizer, and again, we use the Speed Right or a Stay Fix. The Stay Fix, I think it's a 3X. And the Speed Right, it's a model 3000. They're able to be used either plugging them in to regular house current or a 12-volt battery. So they're kind of handy. They put out a lot of voltage for what they are. You can get them actually on eBay or through a fencing dealer. It's really important that we pay attention to what the chargers manufacturer recommends. Very few of them recommend one ground rod. You've got to have 2 ground rods, 10 feet apart, regular ground rods that you can buy at the hardware store. They're copper coated or maybe they're galvanized. We go to auto supply store or maybe even a building supply store. They sell cheap jumper cables for vehicles, and they're not a real thick wire. And you can take those jumper cables and pull them apart, and they will give, so you can use that from going from one ground rod to the other ground rod, and then the first ground rod is just hooked up directly to your Energizer. So at least 2 ground rods. In really dry climate where we are, if things are getting bad, we'll actually water down the area where the ground rods are. That makes a big difference. If we're in an area where we can't do that, then we just take a plastic milk jug, a gallon jug, put a little pinhole in it, put water in it, and put it right next to the ground rod, and that'll slowly let that water go down around that ground rod. Ground rods are so important. People underestimate their importance, and you really need to make sure that they're working correctly. The fence tester that we were talking about, or any fence tester actually, if you touch a ground rod with that, when that thing is on, you actually should be able to touch a ground rod without getting a shock. If you're getting a shock, that's because there's a lot of juice going in the ground rod instead of going down the fence. And you can test the rate direct on your tester, and if it comes up to like 1 kV, 2 kV, that's just not acceptable. About the most you can really put up with is like maybe 200 volts, not 1,000 volts or 2,000 volts or something like that. Because that's not going down the fence. It's just going directly in the ground. It's not doing the charger any good, and it's not doing your fence any good. So don't forget to not only test the fence, but test your ground rods and make sure that they're good. Make sure that they're not, the lower is better, not higher. Higher is not good on the ground rod. Higher is good on the fence. Most of the time, the fences around here, we want to see them around 8,000 volts. As I say, we've been doing it a long time. We have a lot of animals, 4,000 goats and 3,000 sheep. And I couldn't stay in business if we had goats and sheep out. That's just not going to work for me. Again, always keep that fence on all the time. When you're testing your fence, if that fence drops, if it was doing 8,000 volts and you test it sometime and it's down to 5,000 volts, find out why it dropped to 3,000 volts. Walk the line, test your battery, test your grounds, see what's going on. Keep that voltage high. Okay, the other thing that's handy is something called cheat stakes. Now, these are available at Tractor Supply. They're a fiberglass rod, about 4 feet long, and they're used to hold the fence up in soft ground or to help hold the corners tight. It's what we call a cheat stake. It's just a fiberglass rod, and you can, any place that fence is sagging, you can just drive it in the ground a little bit and wrap the top wire. It'll take some of the slack out of it too, and hold that fence up to where it has to go. These are the things to use. Do not buy fencing with a double prong on it, because when it dries out and the ground gets hard, there's almost no way to get those things in the ground. You'll be beating them, they'll be all bent up, and you make a mess out of them. And basically, trying to put one of those pieces of crap in the ground will break your heart. It's just impossible when the ground gets hard. Don't buy two-prong fencing. It will break your heart in tough ground. If you've got rocks, if you've got clay that gets hard when it dries out, this is not the fencing for you. And people think that, and again, it's the people that sell fencing, and everybody thinks, well, that's the expert from afar. These people know what they're doing. Actually, they don't know what they're doing. They don't have the experience, and they don't try to keep 1,000 goats inside of a city someplace with nothing but a psychological barrier fence. All right, when we're talking about this netting fence, and when you look at it, you can't hardly see it, but there's little stainless steel wires in there, very fine wires. You got to look close. They are there, but they don't push a lot of electricity in each wire. There's usually like 6 in each horizontal line. They can only push electricity so far, and that's why when you're using like a 10 or 12 joule fence charger, it's a waste because you can't push that much electricity through those little tiny skinny wires. It's not like a high tensile fence wire. So that's why we're using the 3 joule chargers. And what we do with them is we can run them with about 6 pieces of fence, 5 or 6 pieces of fence on each side of the charger. So we'll have the charger in the middle, and then 5 or 6 going one way, 5 or 6 going the other way. If you can't get around the field, then you're going to need another charger, another whole setup, and you don't hook them together. You never hook those wires together. You don't need, people think, well, we've got to have a circuit. You have to have electricity go all the way around and come back to the charger again. And actually, that's not the way that works, because the electricity goes in your finger, whatever, when you're touching the fence, goes down your body, in your feet. And if it's in a circle, you're actually losing a little bit of electricity because it allows that to go in that circle when it's trying to find that ground again. And really, it's probably better if you don't connect them. Lots of times we do, just in case something comes disconnected, it doesn't shut off the half of the fence. But the bottom line is, you don't need to do that. You can run the fence in a U, and it's going to work just as good, maybe even better, than if you ran it and hooked it back up. They were all hooked up all the way around and made a circle or a square or whatever with it. I've seen a lot of stuff on YouTube that is just boggles the mind. And you can probably find this one guy, but he... on one side of his fence, he left the fence up high so that the bottom wire, which isn't really a wire, it's just a piece of nylon twine or whatever, he lifted it up because so that they could get out from underneath it. If they were going to get out, he wanted them to get out on the one side, not get out on the side that went out into the road. The bottom line, what you're doing with that is, just had no clue about fencing, is you're teaching them to go underneath the fence. It teaches all those goats to go underneath. The goats they're incredibly smart when it comes to that stuff. And they pick up on it. The last thing in the world you want to do is teach a goat to go underneath the fence, because they can flick that fence up with their nose, and you won't be able to keep them in. I've seen it too many times. To me, that was crazy. The other thing he did, when it was time he would put up one enclosure, and then to move it, he'd have another enclosure, which is a way to do it. But what he would do to move them from one side to the other is he'd turn the charger off and then just pick up the fence so that they could all go underneath it and get to the other side, instead of disconnecting the fence and where the 2 posts come together, the 2 rolls come together. Instead of opening it up there, he had them go underneath it. What are you doing? You're teaching those animals to go underneath the fence. The other thing about the netting fence or any kind of electric fence is you want to keep it clean. So I've seen too many people just walk around and stomp things down with their feet. And if you don't have a mower or a weed eater, some way to keep that thing clean, we use a 4-wheeler sometime, but sometimes out here it's so dry it just breaks off, and it's not a big deal. We run over it, and then we can put our fence up, and it's clean enough. In other places, you got a lot of tall green grass. You're going to need some way to knock that grass out of the way. If you don't have a tractor, it's a weed eater. It's not easy. It is so important to keep your fence clean, whatever it takes. Don't just put your fence up and I've seen these guys, we don't have grass this tall. It just doesn't grow that much in the desert. But they'll be putting fence up directly in grass that's 3 or 4 foot high, and the fence will just look like this going down there, and they just can't. I don't even think they must know how much electricity that they're losing in that. But I think that was the guy that was saying he had to have that he was using a 12 joule charger and said everybody ought to use one, and he only had like 2 pieces of fence. And sometimes when we're doing 5 acres at a time. We got a lot of fence out there, a lot of rolls. Again, with the chargers can only push through that little wire so much, so we're only going in maybe lengths of 12 rolls, which is approximately 1,800, 1,900 feet. And then if we need more than that, we just set up another whole setup. Remember, don't hook them together. That's going to screw up the chargers, going to ruin your chargers. Keep them separately. But that's how you keep them in. You keep that fence at a high plane of output, and you won't have any trouble with your goats. What we couldn't do without, though, is the Border Collies. Just a quick word about the Border Collies. People ask me, well, how many goats can you move with the Border Collie? Most of the time, our goats are in groups of like 450 or 500, sometimes 600. You can move about 600 head on a semi-trailer. And if we're going long distances, and sometimes we use semis. Sometimes we use the gooseneck double-deck trailers. They haul about 150 goats, 160 goats. And to be able to load and capture the goats again when we're done, to get out of a particular site and move, we need Border Collies. People ask me, how many goats can you actually push around with a Border Collie? I had one dog that we were going down a road. There was green wheat on both sides of that road, and they were hungry, and we had to go down a section. So that's about 1.5 miles. But one dog kept 1,100 goats up on the road for 1.5 miles. When you're pushing like 1,100 goats or 1,000 goats, even 600 goats, the ones in the front, there's always ones that are leading and getting ahead, and then there's always some laggards behind. So they kind of start getting spread out there. And the Border Collie, most of the time, you'll hear a couple of them in the back scream. Those ones in the back that she's getting a hold of, when they make that noise, the ones in the front get with the program. And goats follow goats. So you need those front ones running out so that the ones in the back will follow. I know there's some Border Collie people say, well, you don't need to bite them to get them to move. Well, if you're working a whole bunch of them like that, you do. Otherwise, they don't have much respect for your dog, and it's not going to work. And in most cases, a lot of sheepdogs won't work for goats, or they won't work for goats very long because the goats will get their number, and it's all over. So most of our dogs they'll work cattle or cow dogs, but they're aggressive. They can get the job done. There are other breeds. I guess I've trained a couple Kelpies in my time, but for the most part, the Border Collie is the dog for the serious stockman, and everybody's got their favorite, and you don't need to get any hate mail over it. But the bottom line is, for us, the Border Collie has got us where we are. It's the dog that we use to handle thousands of animals. All of our herders, and we have over a dozen herders, everybody has a Border Collie. It's not like buying a car, though. You got to learn how the Border Collie works, how the Border Collie thinks, and you got to train one or have one trained for you. If you want to do the kind of things we do, you definitely need a Border Collie. There's just no way. Goats, they're tough to get into a trailer if they don't want to go someplace. Our goats get to the point where they see a ramp they want to run up it because they know they're going to another place with more feed, but they're broke. They've been doing it for years. We don't buy and sell goats. The goats that we started with go back to maybe a couple hundred goats that we actually started with. All these goats, all the females are here. So they learn to do all this stuff. They learn about the fence. The babies are born in this fence. They just don't get out afterwards because they don't know anything different. They don't know they can get out. And I've seen the fence before where a deer knock it down or tree branch comes down on it, and the thing is sitting there zapping on the ground, and the goats won't cross it. They just won't cross it. They just don't know they can, and they won't get out. When something like that happens, you know you're doing it right. But there's really no reason why people should be afraid to get goats because they can't keep them in. There is a learning curve. There's no question about it. There's a learning curve to all this stuff. There's a learning curve to the dogs, and I think our next video is going to be about dogs, and we're going to talk about guard dogs, which where we are, guard dogs are essential. Again, we talked about predators and how little our loss is. I can't even tell you how little it is. It just doesn't happen. It would be rare for us to lose a goat or a sheep to a coyote, and yet coyotes are all over here. You see them all the time. We will occasionally lose one or two to a bobcat. We don't have much in the way of mountain lions, but we do have them. When you're using this kind of fencing, the other thing is you're never in one place too long. And animals, these predator animals, are pretty wary. If you start moving around, they think it's some kind of a trap. So you're here one day, and the next day you're moved a little bit. Coyotes almost never, ever attack on the first night they see the animals come in. 90% of the time, they wait till the third night. It gives you a little time. We didn't talk about RV batteries, but when you're talking about batteries, either to power your fence or to the power of these lights, you want an RV deep cycle battery because you can pull them down farther and they'll be able to charge back up. A regular car battery uses all its juice just to get the motor running, and then it charges right back up quickly. These RV batteries, deep cycle batteries, are better for the kind of stuff we're doing. Okay, well, thanks for watching our first attempt at a video on YouTube, and subscribe because we'll be doing some other videos pretty soon. We're going to be doing on training dogs and border collies and also guard dogs, and a lot of other things you'll be interested in if you've got sheep, goats, even cattle. So hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next video.